Everybody, welcome to Insight class, where First Presbyterian's identity, faith, and values meets today's world. Today is March 28th, 2021, and it's Palm Sunday. So happy Palm Sunday, everybody. Our class meets at 9 a.m. on Sundays. We're doing this obviously over Zoom, and we're also recording it, and it gets put onto the church's YouTube site. Links to the Zoom meeting and links to the YouTube site are available on the church website. So that's kind of your one-stop shop to get to Insight classes, either recorded or live. We have no class next week, which is Easter, of course. In 2 weeks, we're going to start our series on social changes. And our first speaker in 2 weeks is Noreen Bush, the superintendent of the Cedar Rapids schools. So I know that'll be very interesting, and she'll be talking about the schools and the effects of social changes. We have a lot of good speakers for our next series, but they have a very high bar to get over because we're wrapping up this week Heather Hayes' Lenten series, and it's been a really interesting Lenten series. Today she'll be talking about Gethsemane and risking temptation. So Heather, thanks again for doing the series, and looking forward to your wrapping it up for your 6th Lenten series presentation today. And we'll have, as always, with Heather, if you don't mind, I will maybe rudely interrupt you if we're going at 10 minutes because I know you have to get to the service as well. That starts obviously right at 10.
Oh, here comes Gisela too.
Yeah.
Oh, you let her in? Okay. And Nancy.
Yeah.
Everybody seems to be having the exact same morning that I'm having, in which everything is taking twice as long. And I'm going to have to turn off my, make it so I can't see myself because I am so far behind. Hide self view. There we go. Okay. I'm so far behind. It looks really, really weird when it comes across to me. We've got a lot going on today with the Walk with Jesus that's happening right after church. So it's been a bit of a scramble. The other piece is that I pulled all of these materials open. We've been following more or less. What I've been doing is following some of Jill Levine's Entering the Passion of Jesus, a beginner's guide to Holy Week, using some of her materials and then supplementing them with Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan's book, The Last Week. So kind of putting those two things together. Well, I flipped over this week to see, okay, now we're going to do Gethsemane, and her study up until this point in time has been pretty robust, and then when you add in Crossan and Borg, there's a lot of information, different ways of thinking about things, maybe a word that's translated, strangely, sort of lots of meat to dive into. Turns out not so much with the Gethsemane passage. And in fact, most of her study has us, encourages, break into a small group, talk with one another, and assumes she has a reenactment of this time in Gethsemane. And I'm like, okay, none of that works online. So yeah, and then I went into Crossan and Borg, and they have very little to say about Gethsemane. There's a couple of themes, but that to be said, I'm hoping we get some people diving in with some, today is going to be less about, discovering some different interpretation and more about just sort of consideration of some questions about prayer and about nonviolence, which are two of the themes that show up within the context of the Garden of Gethsemane. I did think I'd share a little opening story. So in, let's see, it would have been in 94, I went and traveled to the Holy Land, and or I traveled to the Middle East, and as part of that went and spent some time in Jerusalem. And there was a day that a group of us sort of decided that we had had enough of the tour guide kind of pace of things. You know, if you've ever taken a tour, you know, it's like, okay, everybody, we're going to wake up at 8, and then you're going to go and spend 45 minutes at this site, and then we're all going to travel to this site, and, you know, so on and so forth. So we decided we were going to skip one of the presentations. I can't even remember what it was. And we were going to just head out into the old city by ourselves. And one of the things that wasn't on our schedule of things to see, but we had some interest in, was trying to find what is the attributed site of the Garden of Gethsemane. And turns out it's harder to find than you might think. And we wandered the streets looking for this garden, trying to find this place. Finally stumbled into, it may have been someone's backyard. I really don't know. We went in, and it was a beautiful garden with a lot of olive trees. And so we decided this was going to be our Garden of Gethsemane, and spent some time in prayer and reflection there, which was why we were trying to go. Come to find out, we were in a completely wrong spot. Although we ran into this wonderful Armenian Christian who lived in the old city. His name was George, like almost every Armenian Christian that we ran into. And he showed us both where the actual attributed site of the Garden of Gethsemane was, and then shared the caveat that he said, you know, here in the old holy city, people have, you know, kind of see that divot in the stone. Well, that's where Jesus bumped on his way by, and they set up a shrine to it. So he goes, all of these things are pretty loose around here. They've been around for thousands of years, but it was just meant that somebody at some point in time decided, okay, this is it. And then said, you know, really the Garden of Gethsemane, that attitude of prayer, is wherever you find it. So that's sort of my Gethsemane story. And it points to sort of that centrality of prayer, that it's the culmination of that centrality of prayer that we find woven through Jesus's ministry. And so in some ways, that Garden of Gethsemane is wherever we make it. And also just this idea that I've been chasing after prayer for most of my life, trying to struggle with it and to think about it and to wrap my head around what it does and what it doesn't do, and what I expect from it, and what happens when my expectations aren't met. And that might be part of my sermon actually this morning too, about expectations that are not met. So I thought, let's open up here by reading the passage from Mark. And again, Mark would have been the first the first gospel written, and Luke and Matthew would be very, hi, Martha. I was trying to figure out where in the church you were, but then I realized you're not here down at church yet. That Matthew and Luke would have been source material for Matthew and Luke. So here it is from Mark. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough! The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And all of them deserted him and fled. And a certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught a hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. Okay, so that is Mark's version. Now, Matthew and Luke add some details. We have the naming of Peter as the one who pulled and struck with his sword. And we have the act of Jesus healing the slave that gets inserted in there. The kind of the rebuke of Jesus against Peter, or the one who had used his sword to protect. Now, interestingly enough, there's, I'll just make a couple of notes. So we do have, one of the things that we do have that changes throughout kind of the development of this narrative from one gospel to the other, from Mark, which is the earliest, to Matthew and Luke, which adds some details, to all the way to John, is that in Mark, you will see that things are really done to Jesus, right? Or there is a little bit of a how to talk about this. So for example, in Mark's gospel, Jesus prays, knowing that a trial or something, something is coming, most likely suffering and death. But it's sort of, this cup pass from me, this idea that God, could you, if it is your will, take this cup from me. By the time we reach John, we have Jesus saying, let me see here. We have John instead saying, God, I know all of these, I know what is coming. I wish I didn't have to go through this, but I accept it, and I accept it, and I claim it as my own. This is my path that I am taking. So there's more of a sense of agency and this understanding that, that this thing has to happen for everything that you want God to be fulfilled, to take place. So there's already in Jesus's prayer, this idea that that he already knows, okay, I'm going to be killed, but then don't worry, 3 days I'll be resurrected. So there's much more of a sense of Jesus as an agent of his, he knows what's coming. He chooses it of his own accord. He is not just a willing agent, but that he is a full participant and has made the decision that this will come. So there's more agency on Jesus's part. The sort of the same thing in, so when Jesus talks about, when Judas comes, let's see, what's another difference? Find that. No, that doesn't work. When Mark just has the temple, the guards of the temple come out. So it would be a very small group that would have come out to take Jesus in. And by the time you get to John, it is a whole Roman army, a phalanx of 600 men come out to Jesus. In Mark, there is much more of an essence of he is betrayed, or he is completely and only pointed out by Judas. In John has him coming forward to this detachment of soldiers together with the police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, so this much bigger group. And they came with lanterns and torches and weapons. So again, John is expanding this, but yet Jesus, instead of Judas coming to him and betraying him, he walks out. Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he replies, "I am he." And when he says, "I am he," then John says, everyone fell to the ground. Now, why would they have done that? The "I am," so he would have basically said the name of God. I am Yahweh. I am he. So he had spoken the name of God. And so John really wants to show that even this whole crowd that is coming for Jesus recognizes his power and his authority as the Son of God, but they go ahead and they kill him anyway. So, because basically they fall on their face in like an attitude of worship, but then and then he stepped back, fell to the ground, and asked them again, "Who are you looking for?" "Jesus of Nazareth. If you are looking for me, let these men go." So instead of the disciples fleeing, Jesus is the author again, or in control of the situation, and says, "No, let the disciples go, because you don't want to arrest them. You just want me." So again, a little bit more of a less that the events are being acted upon him, more that Jesus is in control of the events, which is very much how John wants you to understand Jesus throughout the gospel. And then talks about Simon Peter and the sword. And then says, "Put your sword back into its sheath. I must drink the cup that the Father has given me." Again, saying, these are things that are happening. I am choosing this. It is not being done to me, but it is my choice. Okay, so that's just a little background of how there's a little bit of difference between, again, as we progress, and the narrative evolves from gospel to gospel to gospel. Everything from little details like, Matthew and Luke understanding and remembering or thinking about the fact that it's Simon Peter who draws the sword, and Mark not even bothering to mention that, to how John, and in John's gospel, it's very important for him, and you'll see this throughout John's gospel, for him to have the reader of the gospel understand, or it's his position that Jesus really understood his divinity and understood the fullness of what his ministry and his purpose on earth was going to be from the get-go. So again and again, he comes to that in his gospels, and it's even shown in this moment in the Garden of Gethsemane. But let's talk first. But basically there's two things that happen in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the first is this time of prayer. And I mentioned that our theme for today is risking temptation. And it's interesting to note, that Jesus's ministry is seen as is in some ways can be seen as being bookended. In the beginning, what does Jesus's ministry begin with? I'm going to put that out to you since I've been talking for a long time. Where does Jesus's ministry begin? He's baptized, and then what happens? What's the very first thing in all four of the Gospels? I'm putting you on the spot.
Sounds like it should be an easy question, but I'm not sure.
It sounds like it should be an easy question.
Is this the wedding at Cana?
No. Good guess, though. Good guess, because that does come really early in John's Gospel. That's his very first miracle right out of the bat. He starts off early.
Does he preach in the temple?
He then goes and wanders in the wilderness for a few days. And
yes.
insects and yuck.
And right. So in all of the texts, it's really interesting because you have Jesus's baptism. And then it even says, I think in Mark, it says that the Holy Spirit, this dove that descends, drives Jesus out into the wilderness where what does he do to begin it before he like truly begins his ministry? He spends 40 days in fasting and in prayer. And as part of that, he faces what? When he's in the wilderness for 40 days.
He meets
Temptation.
Satan and says, hey, come up here, look down. I'll give you all of this if you'll just join me.
Right. He faces temptation. Right. So he faces temptation. He faces, and it comes, and I'll stumble over him because I haven't really thought this through. He comes through temptation. So he's got the stones into bread. So he's got temptations to provide for himself. He's got a temptation to
Throw himself down.
throw himself down, to ask for protection, and to kneel before the tempter, with the temptation to rule, have power over all that he sees. So that's where Jesus's ministry starts. Okay, so then we bookend again at the end, as he's facing the end of his ministry here. He's in a garden now and not a wilderness space. He's in a garden. Unlike, I would suggest he is not alone, but he is alone, right? So it's, he's still very much on his own to face this, because, it says that continual, he goes to the disciples and they've fallen asleep and they've fallen asleep and they've fallen asleep. And we can circle back around to that, kind of the imagery behind that, or the metaphor behind that. And what does he do? He's in prayer. What do you see, though, as the temptations that are facing him? What could be temptations that are facing him?
Being tempted not to go through what's coming.
Right, exactly. I mean, there's absolutely no reason. I mean, he knows, even just as, regardless, even if you set aside any divine understandings or divine insight, even as a human, if and we've talked about some of these ways that he has been basically poking the Roman bear this whole week. And he's aware that Judas, in some way, shape, or form, is going to betray him. He has mentioned it several times during that evening and that dinner time. And now, I mean, he's there with the 12, the 12 have come out with him. And, you look around and you're like, well, where's Judas? I mean, it's not like, there's a lot of surprise there. He knows Judas has left, and, he's got a choice about what is this path that I am going to take. And he has the ability. I mean, he could have left Jerusalem and taken off. We see that apparently his disciples at least some of them were armed, so he could have resisted. In a physical kind of way. He could have walked back his message, and done things that were more in line with the traditional speeches of the rabbis of his day. So there are all these things in which Jesus can, again, much like he's given a chance to, much like he is at the beginning, a chance to choose another path or divert his intention forward, to something else, and thereby save the potential for any kind of harm to come to him. And so and in the midst of this, he prays. And there's actually one of the things that Dr. Levine did that I thought was really, interesting, because I guess I hadn't thought about it. And she said, that's oftentimes, and we're taught or we think about, when we think about prayer, we feel more comfortable praying for other people, if that makes any sense. It's easier sometimes to lift up a prayer for healing, or a prayer of concern, or a prayer for a situation that exists outside yourself. And because we were, and I have to say, we worry. Some people don't worry about praying and using and trying to use God as this I think it was Betsy Kazat was on the other day talking about prayer as, it was in the women's Bible study, prayer as a cosmic jukebox, or not jukebox, slot machine. If you put in the right number of prayers, then surely you're going to hit the jackpot, and this good is going to come to you. And treating it like this, or gumball machine, you put in a quarter, you get out a gumball, and that there's this transactionalness to God. But Levine talks about the fact that, there is a sense in which personal prayer that just seeks God's presence in the midst of difficult circumstance, is not only acceptable, but it's modeled here by Jesus. And so, that it's this willingness to hold in tension this idea of, God, in my heart, there's this thing that I'm hoping for, I'm wanting, I'm needing, I'm asking for. And that's perfectly a wonderful prayer, as long as it's held in tension with this idea that, but thy will, not mine, be done. That you allow space for the recognition that what you are wanting, hoping, needing, desiring may not be in complete congruence with the unfolding of God's intent. So, and she takes that, she she thinks about Jesus in this place as being, isn't this the same prayer she would suggest that, that a firefighter, that a policeman, a member of the military, somebody who is going out and whose job or whose chosen path might put them in harm's way, but asks for strength and goes forward to do the job or the task, regardless of that potential for harm. That is, we pray that the cup will pass, but we also know that sometimes the cup is ours to bear. So, so then one of the things that I, again, trying to get a little discussion here. Oh my goodness. I talk on more than I think I'm going to. Don't I, Matt?
Oh, it's all good, but you do only have
I know, and I might even pop off a little bit earlier because I was running in last minute and I don't even have my papers in the proper order stack that I like to have them in before we head into service. So when we're thinking about prayer and about temptation, what are the biggest temptations that you face in terms of, or that we all face in terms of making a more difficult choice, perhaps, as we head forward in our lives? Anybody up for that one?
Going with the flow.
Yes. Going with the flow. Right. I put down there inertia.
What about selfishness?
Selfishness. Right. Selfishness. Wanting to make sure that me and mine get the best end of the deal.
But I also think sometimes it's easier to do things for others than it is to do things for ourselves. We've already talked about this. Knowing when to say yes with grace, knowing when to accept help rather than always giving it.
Right. Right. Well, and yes to help, but then also to be able to say no to things too. I mean, in terms of, sometimes it's, the temptation is, oh yeah, to say yes to any request that comes your way. But having some discernment and being able to say no. What are other temptations?
In my case, it's despair over what's going on in our country. And so if you think about selfishness, the despair that there's nothing I can do. That I don't know whether that's in the realm of what you're looking for, Heather, but that's not maybe that's not trusting God, but
you could say, I guess the despair of not thinking you can make a difference, and so therefore falling into apathy is a temptation. Well, I can't do anything anyway. Nothing I do is going to make a difference. Instead of trusting that, okay, well, I can take on, or I can attempt this and trust that God will magnify my actions in it. Any other temptations? I guess one of the ones that I was thinking of for myself, other than inertia, things feel pretty okay. Why rock the boat? Was the temptation or specter of worry about the future. Do I need to do this, this, and this? Or I need to not do this, this, and this because I'm trying to secure this future where I think I will be, or my family will be well and taken care of and happy. And allowing that to become this idea that this is what you need to do to make that happen can be very, can be I guess a siren song that leads you off onto, into maybe, areas that you weren't meant to go, or you refuse to take the risk to even look at them,
Would that be an issue of trying to be controlling, trying to
Yeah, that's a good way of
control what happens, what comes from God to you too?
Right. If I can't think of a good example. Okay. So say there was some type of street ministry startup And they, and they said, oh, Heather, Presbyterian said, Heather, we'd like to tap you to take this, but we're not going to provide any health care, and your salary is going to be, $15,000 a year. But we really think you're called to this ministry. Part of the reason I would hesitate would be, I would be thinking through, not just, do I have the gifts and skills? Is this something that's needed? And all of that. There would be a part of me, most definitely, that would say, oh, well, gosh, that would impact, the bottom line of my retirement, and, and how I was living today. And those kinds of things, we should be honest with. They come in, and they are temptations that sometimes maybe can keep us from fully thinking about or responding to different opportunities that God puts in our path for faithfulness. And that's just a goofy one, but I kind of think that dynamic is part in play. Okay. Anyone have anything else on temptation? If not, I am tempted to call it a day. And go make sure my sermon pages are in order. I don't end up scrambling.
Well, you don't want to have to worry about that.
Right. Well, there's been a couple of times early on in my ministry, there has been, where pages get shuffled. And then that's even almost more flustering than trying to preach from an outline, just preach, because then you're like, oh my gosh, where am I in this? And then all of a sudden my mind always goes blank. So I always, every time, 1, 2, 3, make sure they're handwritten and in order before I start. So
thank you again.
Thank you very much for being a part of this with me through all of these weeks. And I hope everyone has a very blessed Easter, and that we see you either online or in the park, and that you're back in a couple weeks to Insight.
Right. 2 weeks, as we were saying at the beginning, 2 weeks, we have the superintendent of Cedar Rapids Schools, Noreen Bush, is going to be.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing Noreen. She's a great person. So.
It'd be great. Thank you again, Heather, for doing this series. And,
not a problem.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt.
Bye.